Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait one more minute as a few more people join the webinar. So hold on tight for one more minute. Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. This is a webinar about a new report titled New England Food Policy, Building a Sustainable Food System. The report and this webinar are a project of American Farmland Trust, Conservation Law Foundation, and the Northeast Sustainable Agriculture Working Group, and we call those groups AFT, CLF, and NESAWG for short. Thank you all for taking time out of your schedule to join us. Today's speakers will be Chris Coffin, who is the New England Director of American Farmland Trust, Kathy Roof, who is a Senior Fellow at the Northeast Sustainable Agriculture Working Group, Mark Winnie, who is a Senior Advisor to the Food Policy Networks Project at the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, and myself, Jenny Rushlow. I'm a Staff Attorney and Director of the Farm and Food Initiative at Conservation Law Foundation. This is the first in a series of webinars for this project. This first webinar will be an orientation to the report and an opportunity to deepen your exposure to the topics covered in the report. There will be a time for questions and feedback later in the webinar. There will be an additional 6 webinars following this one. These future webinars will be a deeper dive than today, which is more of an overview. Each of our future webinars will focus on a particular topic from each chapter of our report. In the future webinars, chapter authors will be joined by other topic experts, and these webinars will take place in June, July, and September. As for some logistics, some of you have participated in webinars before. If this is your first webinar experience, we'll try and make it easy for you. We have a webinar technical coordinator and organizer today who is Anelkis Royce of American Farmland Trust, and she's available to answer any technical questions that you may have. At the outset, I should say that you don't need to worry about background noise at your location because each of your locations has been muted and only the presenters will be heard during the presentation. However, that doesn't mean you can't communicate with us. You can see on the right side of your screen a toolbox through which you can type in questions, either substantive or technical. And Anelkis will type back answers to you personally about your technical questions, and she'll provide your substantive questions to the presenters to answer during our Q&A portion of the webinar. We will have time for questions at 2 points during the program today. And this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the American Farmland Trust website shortly after the webinar. So with all of that covered, I'll kick off the presentation now describing the context of our report and project. And for those who may have joined late, again, I'm Jenny Rushlow from Conservation Law Foundation. Could we move to the second slide, please? So to start off, just a quick introduction to each of our organizations. These 3 groups work together on this project, and it's American Farmland Trust, who works to save the land that sustains us by protecting farmland, promoting sound farming practices, and keeping farmers on the land. Conservation Law Foundation, which is a New England-based environmental advocacy organization that uses the law, science, and the market to create solutions that preserve our natural resources, build healthy communities, and sustain a vibrant economy. And finally, the Northeast Sustainable Agriculture Working Group, or NESAWG, which is a 12-state network uniting farm and food system practitioners and allies to build a sustainable, just, and economically vibrant region. So again, these 3 groups partnered on this project together. Next slide. To focus a moment on our project objectives, the focus of this work is on the New England food system. And some context for what that looks like is that currently New England produces 50% of the dairy products we eat, 40% of our vegetables, 10% of our fruit, and 1% of our meat. So there's a lot of room to increase those percentages so that we're producing more of the food that New Englanders consume. The purpose of our report and our project is to foster the development of a vibrant New England food system and to create a shift so that as much food as possible is produced, processed, distributed, and purchased within the region, with a result of maximum resilience, minimum importation, and significant economic and social return to the region. The report we produced, New England Food Policy, Building a Sustainable Food System, was released in March 2014. It analyzes policy gaps and barriers around increasing production and consumption of New England-sourced food and makes policy suggestions for addressing those gaps and barriers. The area of focus for our work was public policy because some of our existing policies, particularly at the federal and state levels, create significant barriers to expanding the regional food system, and those barriers need policy remedies. And there's great opportunity for policy change to move us in the right direction, both state by state and through greater collaboration as a region on policy issues. And why do we focus on New England? New England is particularly ripe for this framing. As a region, we have a rich agricultural history and a rich agricultural present with opportunity for growth. But as 6 small states, we have different agricultural strengths and weaknesses, and we can achieve more together as a region than each state can independently. There's also precedent for the 6 New England states to work together on policy issues, and we discuss that in detail in Chapter 6 of our report. Our work was built on the foundation of several existing efforts already in place to increase the sustainability of our food system. First, in 2010, the 6 New England Chief Agricultural Officers, under the auspices of the New England Governors Conference and its Commission on Land Conservation, drafted a regional action plan to increase production and consumption of New England-grown farm and food products. And that plan was called the New England Farm and Food Security Initiative to keep farmland and farming. It had 6 focus areas: research, dairy, food safety, farmland protection, farm to institution, and meat processing. And in 2011, that effort spawned the creation of Farm to Institution New England, or FINE for short, and a Farm Bill priority setting process among the 6 Chief Agricultural Officers with their Mid-Atlantic colleagues. And work in those key focus areas continues. Another effort of existing work is we're building on the existing state food system planning processes. Food policy councils bring together stakeholders to engage in food system planning efforts and policy development. At the state level, some of these councils are created through legislation or executive order with an official mandate or obligations, and others operate independently, though may include representation from public officials. And in addition to those state food policy councils, there are local food policy councils throughout the region. We're also building on an existing effort called the New England Food Vision, which is a project of Food Solutions New England, a regional food systems learning action network dedicated to advancing a sustainable New England food system. This is a multi-phase project to develop a regional food vision. And this is a bold vision that calls for our region to build the capacity to produce at least 50% of clean, fair, just, and accessible food for all New Englanders by 2060. The vision includes a set of guiding principles and calculations that sketch a future in which diverse local and state food systems are supported by and in turn support a regional sustainable food system. A draft of that vision was released in 2013, and we expect the full report to be released shortly. So we're building on these existing efforts. One key goal of our work is to provide support to state planning efforts, because as these planning efforts continue, there's a key need for regulatory and policy change to facilitate necessary advancements. We also examine policies that will be important to moving the region in the direction of the New England Food Vision. And we focused on federal, regional, and state policies in particular. There's some limited discussion of local policies, particularly with regard to urban agriculture, but that area is less of a primary focus than the federal and state especially. Next slide, please. To briefly describe how we approached our work, we engaged in nearly 2 years of research and analysis. Our primary research consisted of extensive interviews, 24 formal interviews, and many more informal conversations with experts in the field, including the chief agricultural officers in each state, as well as other agricultural agency staff, advocates, academics, members of the Farm Bureau, leadership from the Farm Bureau and Farmers Union, people in food processing and distribution, seafood, and many other areas. In addition to that primary research, we also engaged in policy research and analysis, researching existing relevant state and federal laws and regulations and other policies, as well as regional models for states to work together to achieve their shared goals. So with that background, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Coffin from American Farmland Trust, and Chris will provide a review of the report and key takeaways from each chapter.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. Again, this is Chris Coffin, and I'm going to walk you through the chapters of the report. Again, as Jenny said, we are planning follow-up webinars that are going to go into depth in each of the chapters, and that's the chapters that you see on your screen right there. So this is really an intended overview of just sort of key findings from each of these chapters. And importantly, these are not, our findings here are not recommendations. We put them as policy options where we saw states that were working particularly or federal programs that were extremely important. But again, this is intended as much to spur discussion about what are policies that states and the region might want to pursue, where things are working well, where additional actions are needed. So these, again, are the categories. It was intended to be full circle in the food system, from land and then back to land with the waste streams, and then looking at frameworks for ways that the region might work more collaboratively around food system policy. Let me just say that on these chapters, and the focus of this report was really specifically on increasing production and consumption of New England sourced foods. So number one, it was about food. It was not about all agriculture products, and we recognize that there is a significant amount of agriculture in New England that is not food-based. Secondly, it was not about addressing issues around things like reducing food insecurity, improving nutrition. These are, we recognize that these are important issues and very important to address in the region. Food justice, many things this report does not cover. Again, it had the lens of just looking specifically at increasing production and consumption. Where there was overlap and where we saw that there were programs and policies that were working to achieve broader goals, we did talk about that some. So let's move on and look at, start with land. So as we all know, New England is very land challenged. Only 5% of our land base is in crop and pasture land, which translates to less than 1/4 of an acre per person. So not surprisingly, access to affordable farmland was seen as a significant barrier in the region to both new farmers looking to get into the business and to established farmers looking to grow their enterprises. So in terms of policy needs in this arena, we really looked at what are the tools that are needed to encourage farm succession, transferring that farm, making sure that that land stays in agriculture as it transitions from farmer to next buyer. What are ways to promote farmland leasing, innovative ways that we might do that. We also look a little bit at farmland reclamation. Again, when one looks at the vision, and the vision, New England Food Vision, that talks about needing 6 million acres of land in production, what would be the ways that we could look to do reclamation that is sustainable and has good conservation as part of it? So continued loss of productive farmland is obviously still a concern. The 2012 census that just came out shows that while there is a little bit of the total land in farms has increased in most of the states in the region. In fact, when you look behind the numbers, there is continued loss in the amount of cropland and in some states in pasture land, and that when you look at the natural resources inventory, there is a loss of prime farmland, whether that's in active agriculture or under trees. So again, policy needs in this area is to really think about what are We need to continue those federal and state investments in farmland protection. We need to think about better farmland mitigation strategies. And we need to be working more, and there's some success in this region around smart growth strategies and denser development, but there's probably more that we can do in that area. Sorry. And just lastly, on the urban land access, again, this one is largely, as Jenny mentioned before, mostly a local zoning issue, but we wanted to call attention to it. There might be things that states that can do in this arena, probably are, and this is just a shout out as one policy example to Boston and their Article 89, which actually was a pretty comprehensive rewrite of their zoning regulations to reduce the barriers to commercial urban agriculture. So moving on to food production, the region, in addition to be challenged by land, we've got challenges both in terms of labor costs and availability and the cost of other inputs, particularly energy. So looking at farm labor, we looked both at one of the things that was identified as a big need was a new federal guest worker program that has been part of the larger discussions around immigration reform. There is some use of the federal H-2A program in the region. It's expensive, it's complicated, it is not applicable to many of the dairy farms in the region, and it's a little bit problematic, hence the suggestion for or the interest in the new federal guest worker program. There also seem to be opportunities in some states that are already focused on workforce development around food and agriculture. And again, what are the policy opportunities around that? Secondly, climate change is clearly already having an impact in the region and will obviously continue to do so. And as there are more extreme weather events, whether that's excess rain or whether it is drought, we will continue to need in the region better risk management tools. Many of those are federal. There has been some progress in this farm bill. More is clearly needed in that regard. There's also, we need to recognize the increased investments around research and development. That is addressing new pests, new funguses, new things associated with weather changes, and also looking at how these conservation investments in the region can really help to be a risk management tool against things, again, like drought and like excessive moisture. And then finally, looking at things, what are the opportunities around controlled environment farming, that is farming typically under glass or in warehouses. What are the opportunities for doing more of that type of farming as a supplement to the other types going on in the region. And lastly, in this arena, where we look in terms of the food production and focuses on production efficiencies and opportunities, is that there has been significant amount of investment in the region in what we call farm enterprise development. Many of these programs are the farm viability type programs, or in Vermont, the Working Lands Enterprise Fund is an example of a more recent program. That these are really helping farmers to expand their markets, to improve their efficiencies, and suggesting that a need to continue to support these types of programs. Moving on, you will see this is the kind of middle of the supply chain, and we recognize that food safety here is not just the middle of the supply chain. Food safety obviously starts on the farm and it continues on in the markets, but it just seems the most logical place to put it in the report. So that's why it's in here. And in terms of the middle of the supply chain, again, food safety, and specifically the new Food Safety Modernization Act, is the big gorilla in the room. It could well have an impact on expansion of fruit and vegetable production in the region, depending on how the rules for the act are shaped, and those rules came out in draft form. FDA has gone back to the drawing board in part because of some of the great work that happened around this region in organizing concerns and tours and visits with FDA. So that is just something that people need to be very aware of, and that the region will continue to need to be very vigilant on. Regardless of how FSMA turns out, there will also be a need for food safety training for the region's farmers. Some of that is happening, but that is probably an area where continued and increased investments will be needed. Thinking about food hubs, again, food hubs have a very different definition for everybody who uses the word, but if one thinks of them sort of broadly as a way of aggregating and moving product, there is a need and a lot of work being done, again, in the region on how do you do this to particularly meet those large retail and institutional markets. So thinking about the needs here that are around, some of them are around what are the types of food hubs that are promoting those fair returns to farmers, and what are the continued investments and needs related to food hubs. And again, as a policy example, this is not in the report. This is something that happened more recently, was a state bill in Maine, which is LD 1431, that would have provided some additional incentives for the creation of food hubs that were particularly focused on the food school districts. I mean, focused on school districts and trying to get products to schools. So that's an area where one state has really focused on this. And lastly, on the question of looking to meat and poultry slaughter and processing, again, one of the needs, in addition to the needs for additional capacity, particularly in the processing end, is for additional business training and support for those slaughter and processing businesses is one key area that seems to be ripe for additional policy. So moving into the home stretch here, on marketing, so this was focused on any number of different kinds of markets. Some of our work looked at direct-to-consumer marketing, and clearly that's an area where that direct-consumer relationships have helped to improve profitability. So in terms of what more is needed and how policy can continue to support that, it is to particularly look around in those direct-to-consumer arenas, where can we at the state and regional, and in some cases local in this regard, continue to look about regulations, both around public health, around farmers markets, around some of the processing requirements that are continuing to reduce those barriers to the direct-to-consumer opportunity while still not disregarding impacts on potential public health, et cetera, but that there seems to be greater opportunities to streamline and rethink some of those regulations. Second, state procurement policies and geographic preferences. Every state in the region, and this gets into the broader question around branding campaigns, and states doing much to try and encourage and recognize their own state products. There's more that can be done in that arena around strengthening state procurement policies, and to potentially consider a two-tiered approach that would prefer products grown in a particular state first, but then have a second tier of preference that would be a preference for regionally produced foods after a first tier of state-produced foods. And lastly, we took a look at some of the state and federal nutrition programs, and there's clearly an opportunity with some of these programs. There already is, and there's more of an opportunity to think about them as having double impacts or double bottom line of both improving nutrition, improving access to healthy food, and allowing and providing some additional economic opportunities for the region's farmers. And so when you look at double coupon programs as an example of that, you look at the farmers market nutrition program, the senior farmers market program. Those are examples where that is already having an impact. And again, this shout out on the policy example, this is not in the report again because it was more recent. In the Farm Bill, the latest Farm Bill, the Food Insecurity Nutrition Incentive Grants provide a new opportunity. It's $100 million in grants over the next 5 years that is essentially creating a double coupon program. USDA will provide 50% of a project cost. So this is intended to incentivize SNAP participants access to fruits and vegetables, and particularly looking at what are the opportunities in the direct consumer arena. So there is a specific example of where the region might, or states in the region have an opportunity to get some additional funding, federal funding, to do double coupon programs. And then lastly, we took a look at waste streams. Kathy, if you can.
Oh, sorry.
So this was the last area, and again, we looked at, okay, now post-market, obviously lots of organic matter is going into landfills. In the ideal world, it would not. It is organic matter that could be returned to the land and improve the land. So obviously, in the process of improving soil health, it can also reduce methane emissions and potentially provide, again, some additional economic opportunity for farmers, both through composting and through energy generation, particularly with methane digesters. So when you look around the region, there's 3 states in the region, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Vermont, that have all adopted phased-in statewide bans on landfilling food scraps. Rhode Island is apparently actively thinking about that. Not quite clear where New Hampshire and Maine are in that regard, but that is something that is certainly moving us towards this direction of returning organic matter back to the land. Looking at other 2 areas where policy could have an impact here, and what more might need to be done, is looking around the region in terms of composting regulations. They're in an effort to ensure that compost is both high quality and protecting public health. It creates, in some instances, disincentives for farmers to want to compost. In some cases, regulations are costly, they're expensive. So thinking more thoughtfully about how these composting regulations at the state level might work so that they really are providing an opportunity for farmers would seem to be valuable to do. And then secondly, thinking about additional reducing of barriers and expanding incentives for farmers for anaerobic digesters. In some cases, state regulations or local regulations are limiting the amount of additional product that farmers can bring onto a farm to add to their digesters if they don't have enough organic matter of their own. So that is in some cases a barrier. And then what are additional incentives, both federal and state? There are quite a number out there, but just sort of rethinking, are there more things that we can do in that regard? So that's all a summary, and again, we are going to, in subsequent webinars, go into much more detail in each of the chapters, but I hope that that was a good overview for everyone. So let me turn it over now to Kathy Roof with NESAWG, who is going to focus on the regional aspect of the report.
Thanks, Chris.
Hi, everybody. I first want to say how amazingly great it is that we have nearly 80 people on this webinar who have chosen to prioritize listening about regional policy work on their lunch break. So this is great and very promising for the work ahead. So as Chris and Jenny mentioned in describing the gist of this report, we spent a lot of time looking at sort of what the landscape is around certain areas of the food system. And one of the strong themes throughout has been to look at New England as a region. And as many of you know, NESAWG is particularly interested in thinking regionally. And in fact, in just the latest few years, I would say that a lot of people's language has expanded from only thinking about local food systems to talking about local and regional. So if we see the 6 New England states as a region, it gives us a lot of opportunity to build a more robust and resilient food system for all of us. There is, in our research, the landscape is littered with failed attempts for multiple states to work together, but there are also strong examples of where it is successful. We certainly in the region have a history of multi-state collaboration, and as Jenny described in the very beginning of this webinar, there are current collaborations among the 6 New England Ag Commissioners and Secretaries. Food Solutions New England has certainly brought people together at a regional level over the last several years. So there is a strong foundation for us to build a sort of regional orientation. That said, there are also barriers to working together, and we need to be cognizant of those and sort of think about the fact that there are state-focused mandates. There is cultural parochialism, which is really understandable. States do prioritize protection of their own farmers and resources, and that absolutely makes sense. There are bureaucratic constraints, and there's real as well as perceived competition for scarce resources. So these are some of the issues that we need to swim upstream against when we do think regionally. It's also really important for us to note that effective regional structures depend on what is the problem that needs to be addressed. There's no one best model for interstate cooperation, so it really requires us to do a solid analysis of what is the problem that we need to address and at what scale is it most appropriately addressed. So in the process of working together with you all going forward, that's what we're going to want to do. Among the options is to, in fact, explore some kinds of regional food system planning entities and processes, and I'll get into that a teeny bit more as we move along here. So those of you who have read through the report, congratulations. You may have noted that some of the examples under regional food system coordination are represented here as examples. Some of the models for regional cooperation are quite formal, such as interstate compacts, commissions, and authorities, and the report chapter details several examples and sort of how these structures function in real life. Some of you may remember the Northeast Interstate Dairy Compact, which was successful on a lot of levels. It's very complicated to get a compact initiated, and often they require federal blessing. So I'm not saying that we're going to pursue any one of these models. This is just sort of by way of understanding the universe of regional cooperation. Memoranda of understanding are slightly less formal, but they are executed at a high level. A very successful example is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which you can read a little bit more about in the chapter. Regional harmonizing and regulatory harmonizing and reciprocity in the agriculture arena was an interesting example of reciprocity, which means that if you have regulatory permission, so to speak, in one state, it would count in another state. and for a while there was such a thing for pesticide applicators. It's now defunct, and I don't know why that happened. It would be good to learn about whether that was a failure of the model or something else happened there. So harmonizing means that the states would have relatively similar regulations on purpose, and reciprocity would be even more formal, where a regulation in one state would qualify in another state. Intergovernmental councils, there are numerous examples. A more formal example is NESAWG, the Northeastern States Association of State Departments of Agriculture. In our region, that's actually 12 states plus Puerto Rico, but the 6 New England chief ag officers do work in that context, and it's a pretty strong organization, meets regularly, and there really is a lot of sharing at that level. So that's a strong example. In the report, we do talk about particular areas for regional coordination, and before I get into that, I just want to sort of re-emphasize that there are several kinds of ways that regions can work together, and hopefully all of you on the call and others who will be weighing in this project will be able to contribute to this thinking and analysis. Certainly as a region, to have a voice, a unified voice in federal policy, much of what Chris talked about is happening at the federal level through the Farm Bill or through the Food Safety Modernization Act. So sort of uniting our advocacy for federal laws and regulations that will benefit or at least not work to our detriment is a really strong area for regional coordination. There's the whole universe of regulatory and statutory work as a region. Then not specifically policy-oriented, but I think we have a lot of opportunity to look at sort of the consultative and educational arenas where we can share best practices and approaches, do collective research, share our extension expertise at the land-grant level, and so on. And finally, in the marketplace, the issue of branding that Chris talked about briefly. Regional branding is tricky. There is the Harvest New England initiative, which is sort of rekindling its energy, and certainly those are the kinds of things that we would want to think about and where they might be effective and appropriate, but certainly not a single solution. So in the report, we do call out very particular areas for greater regional coordination. Some of these have been, or all of these have been mentioned pretty much. Food Safety Modernization Act, cross-pollination on various policy issues, including tax, such as state taxes for farmers, state land use issues, making public land available, and so on. Institutional procurement, that tiered approach that Chris mentioned, meat processing regulation, and then meat regional branding, which I just referenced. In addition, we certainly have the opportunity for lots of dialogue and planning at upcoming events, and this is where we want to sort of get into next steps. And I think before we do that, Jenny, were we going to field some questions?
I think you can finish your piece first before we field questions.
Okay. So the exciting part of this project is that from this report, we're able to, thanks to our funders, take the report and use it as a foundation for action. And in the next 8 months or so and going forward from there, we do have an opportunity to work with all of you to take some of the suggestions from this report, but also build from the report into other arenas for food policy advocacy. Some of you have been involved in Food Solutions New England, and its annual summit is coming up, at which we will have, again, an opportunity to talk about this report and project and engage some of the delegates in thinking more concretely about some of these regional approaches. We will provide briefings and presentations upon request, so if any of you in our audience today would like any of us to come and talk with your Food Policy Council, your working group, your legislators, we're happy to do that. If you have other ideas for how we can engage at various events, we are happily open to that. We did identify some areas for future research and analysis, and we are open to ideas and resources that you might have to bring to that conversation. And then, as Jenny mentioned, a series of webinars. This one, and then on a selected topic from each of the report chapters. And then we will have a special thread on the regional cooperation as well. We will offer a series of teleconferences. They could be by state, so we could mobilize with your help folks within your state to talk about specifically what's going on in your state or locale. Could be by topic or issue if we have some ongoing interest in sort of drilling down even further into a particular issue and how to translate that into action. And also ongoing group, I hope, to look more particularly at these opportunities for regional coordination and collaboration. We will offer at least one or maybe more in-person meetings. We have one tentatively scheduled for, Mark, I think I got the date wrong. We'll follow up with you all. I think it's possibly July 28th or 29th. 26th is a Saturday, and we don't mean that. And then a wide range of technical assistance to groups, and all you need to do is ask for it. You'll hear a little bit from Mark Winnie in just a few moments. Many of you know him as an expert on food policy councils and food system policy. And Amy Little is the organizer for NESAWG and has decades of experience in organizing and is eager to help groups with capacity building and strategizing in those arenas. In addition, we can bring issue experts to bear if you have a particular question or issue related to policy in your state. We would be happy to work with you on that as well. So I think that's it, Jenny. We could entertain questions now and then turn it over to Mark for his reflections. And then looks like we'll still have some time at the end for more questions.
Great. So as Kathy mentioned, we do still have more program to offer, but we're going to take a break now for some questions and then return to the program in a few minutes. So this will be the first of two opportunities to ask questions. Several people have submitted questions already, which is great. You can submit questions by typing your question into the box on the right-hand side of your screen, and it'll then be passed along to our speakers. So please go ahead and submit more questions as they come to you. We'll do our best to answer every question that we've gotten. However, if there are questions that require more of a deep dive with a specific author or topic expert, we may get back to you through email. So the first question we got was, how did you know that New England produces that amount, and how do you know what is consumed within the region? I think that's referring to one of the early slides that specifically called out how much meat, vegetables, dairy, et cetera, we're producing within the region for our own consumption by New Englanders. And Chris, do you, I believe those were your numbers, do you have any background on that?
Yes, the two sources of information on that are both, and this will become available as soon as the New England Food Vision is released. Brian Donahue, the chief author, who is a professor at Brandeis University, includes in that Food Vision quite a bit of focus and looking at how much the region is producing relative to demand. And again, some of those demand numbers are nationally derived as opposed to knowing specifically by state what consumption is. The other group of researchers who have done quite a bit of this work are Tim Griffin and colleagues at Tufts University, the Friedman School of Nutrition. Tim did a report on regional self-reliance, and that includes quite a number of, quite a bit of information. So I'm trying to think of whether we could post that Tim Griffin paper. We probably could on the New England Food Policy webpage, and so we'll look to be able to do that.
Great. Our next question is, there's interest in a Massachusetts or regional meeting of policy councils. I assume that means food policy councils. Are there any plans for organizing a meeting or summit? Kathy, do you want to respond to that?
I think that the idea for July might well wind up being targeted to food policy councils for that July meeting for the 6 New England states. We haven't totally confirmed that. If that doesn't happen, then there would be some opportunity for Mark to work with food policy councils either at the state level or regionally in the fall.
Great. Our next question has to do with climate change. And the question is there any integration of New England food system into climate change, including possible effects of changing climate on crops and growing practices, decarbonization of food systems, soil systems as climate change mitigation? I'll take a crack at that. What I would say is that climate change is included throughout our report rather than having a specific chapter or section on climate change because it bears on every aspect of the food system. It's touched on in many places throughout the report. The sections that I think are most relevant to the question that was posed are there's a section on environmental impacts from agriculture in Chapter 2 that touches on ecosystem services and government programs that provide revenue streams to farmers for engaging in conservation practices and the types of mitigation against climate change that was mentioned in the question. So that section is quite relevant. There's also a section on research, development, and extension, also in Chapter 2, which would speak to the kinds of research needs around adaptation to adjusting to the impacts of climate change on our agricultural system. And then finally, there's a section on farm energy needs and opportunities also in Chapter 2 that speaks to some ways that we can increase energy efficiency on farms and on-farm renewable energy production. So those are the places where I think it's dealt with most directly, although climate change appears throughout the report. Chris, did you want to add anything related to that?
No. I guess the only thing that I would say is, again, there is some research being done around climate change and impacts on crop production in New England. That is a large USDA NIFA-sponsored project that involves quite a number of institutions in New England. I know that Tufts, again, is one of the universities involved in that, and Tim Griffin at the School of Nutrition there would be a good one to reach out to. There are other institutions, but Tim is the one who immediately comes to mind.
Our next question relates, I think, to something that Chris said in her discussion of the land chapter and the need to ensure that we're keeping farmland in farming. The question is, so why does the census show a slight increase in land in farms? And I assume that's a reference to the most recent ag census, which showed that there was a slight increase in the amount of land in farms in certain New England states. And Chris, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, and that's, so it's a really good question, and it also, we have to recognize the limitation of what the census tells us and doesn't tell us. It tells us whether there is more land in farms or in a particular land use category or less. We don't know if the less, we don't know whether because it was land that's no longer in production because it's now in housing or is just not in production or changed. So what we do know is while there was like 165,000 new acres of land and farms in the region, was a change in cropland almost the same, 150 some odd thousand acres, fewer acres in cropland than there in 2012 than there were in 2007. Again, we don't know what happened to that land. You look at the other categories, there's also a decrease in pasture land overall in the region, and there's an increase in woodland. So unclear to American Farmland Trust whether that means that that cropland went into woodland, but we tend to look at it with the Natural Resources Inventory or the NRI data, which does talk about conversion, and those numbers continue to show an increase in converted agricultural land. I don't have those most recent numbers right at our fingertips. So from our perspective, land loss is still a concern, something that needs to be addressed.
Thanks. Our next question, and we'll do just a couple more before we return to the speaking program. The question is, what role is there for our schools in agriculture? Chris, maybe you can speak to how that's discussed in our markets chapter.
Yeah, so I'm looking at this question, and I don't know whether it's schools of agriculture or schools in agriculture, so I guess I'll answer it in two different ways. So if it's specifically around schools of agriculture, I take that to mean land grant universities and particularly ag vocational schools or VOTEC schools. Certainly a role for those types of schools, particularly around workforce development and community colleges. Again, that's where we look at the opportunity, the needs around both food and agriculture, growing a next generation of farmers, and there's obviously a lot of great work that's happening around the region and a lot of new curriculum around sustainable agriculture and food systems. So there's plenty of things happening in the region, but I think that what we found was that there's still opportunity to do more maybe cross-state collaboration or thinking about that workforce development and how states might be able, and folks within those states might be able to learn from each other about what are those opportunities and how folks are doing curriculum around that. More broadly on the how do you engage schools in agriculture, obviously it's educating the next generation of consumers. We don't really talk about that education. And again, that's kind of beyond the scope of this report, but I do think that would be a very right area for conversation of curriculum generally around food and agriculture for consumers. Then in terms of institutional procurement, again, schools are by far the largest, I think, from a farm to institution New England work, and thinking of those statistics that schools and universities are the largest purchasers of food. So continued work and certainly Farm to Institution New England and its many partners around the region are doing a lot to focus on that institutional procurement, but many things in the report that relate to that we'll talk about when we do a webinar specifically on markets.
Great. So with that, we're going to pause on the questions. We'll have time, another 10 minutes or so for questions at the end of the program. But right now we're going to hear from Mark Winnie, who is with the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. And Mark is going to address observations and opportunities generated by this report and project.
Okay, good day, everybody. Thank you for making me a part of this project. I wanted to say from the outset that while I was not a contributor to the report, I was an avid reader, and I'm continued to be a practitioner and food policy activist. Some of you probably remember that I was in New England, specifically in Hartford, Connecticut, for 25 years, and continue to be have strong interest in what's going on in the region. Though I left some years ago to pursue my interest in red and green chili and really good margaritas, I still care deeply about what's going on in New England and get back from time to time. Through my work at Johns Hopkins, I now have been able to support more actively food policy councils and the development of local and state food policy around the country. And I've worked with many of you, many of the people on the call, I'm sure, in that regard. So, as a reader of this report and as somebody who's really keenly interested in its application and its use, some things kind of jumped out at me. And I'm also going to respond from as if I was you, put myself in your shoes, perhaps as someone involved in a food policy council or involved in a food coalition or someone who just has an active interest in food policy. I did note the absence of any sort of longer-term discussion of such things as food insecurity and food access and equity, as Chris pointed out right from the beginning. I don't think that that's a hindrance. For those of you who are doing food system work, I imagine you're engaged in some way in those issues, that there's a lot of cross-pollination going on between those who are anti-hunger, food security advocates, and those who are more of your local food system, local food advocates, and wanting to support a more robust agricultural economy. I think we have an opportunity here to engage across those different sectors within the food system. I'm sure many of you are doing it already, and I think this report provides you with good, solid, really solid information about how to engage in a more active way particularly with regard to promoting and developing and strengthening our the agricultural sector. But of course, there are good overlaps, and I think there's opportunities for you to explore those. Farm to School certainly presents us with that kind of opportunity for an intersection between supporting the growth of a vibrant local food economy and providing good quality food to our children. The Farm to School movement is very robust these days, and certainly there are plenty of good opportunities for you to engage there. Procurement is mentioned in the report, and procurement certainly is very much a part of the Farm to School discussion, as it is in overall just what are state policies, what are local policies as well with respect to buying local. And I do know, while the report does have a fairly heavy emphasis on the sort of the state and federal policy, food policy areas, we do know that while people who are engaged in local food policy work as well, there are certainly many intersections, and that we often see state policy emerging as a result of grassroots activism, of people looking at their own communities and see what else needs to be done, while cities and counties may offer you the opportunity for policy action. You often have to go up to the state level or even eventually the federal level. So new policies, new ideas, new actions percolate upwards from the grassroots, generally speaking. And looking for those synergies between local, state, and federal policy is something I would hope that many of you are doing already. Again, I think this report offers this massive and comprehensive menu of options, some that you may be engaged in already, but others that are maybe brand new. And I think it's always exciting to see what is going on elsewhere and see how you might apply it to your own circumstances. I know that when I was a practitioner particularly in Connecticut, we would shamelessly beg, borrow, and steal ideas from other states. The growth of the Farmers Market Nutrition Program is really about that sharing between states and practitioners in its early days in the 1980s and 1990s. In Connecticut, we stole from Massachusetts and for the development of our Farmers Market Nutrition Program. We later stole from Massachusetts and Maine with regard to farmland preservation policies as we were facing a tremendous loss in farmland and looking for new policy ideas and new programmatic ideas as well. So as you look at the report and you look at what's going on in different states, I would urge you to say, is that something that I can do in my place as well? And what would it look like here? I think that we're hoping that we can see a somewhat more formal sharing of ideas and a more cross collaboration and sort of a cross-pollination taking place. I think we're always really a bunch of busy little bees that are pollinating each other's gardens, and I hope that continues. But perhaps we can, look that the report can give us some and the suggestions around collaboration and regional systems and regional policy approaches might give us an opportunity for a somewhat more formal engagement around this idea of and this challenge of creating more regional food policies. I'll note that that food policy councils, which is kind of my special area of interest these days, while there are a few state food policy councils in New England and perhaps some networks, I know Maine has a food policy network. I don't get too hung up on the terminology because I know that these are groups, coalitions, or networks that are definitely interested in policy, food policy. So whether we call them a food policy council or a food system network isn't as important as what it is they're doing, and typically they are looking at policy. And again, this report gives you a lot of good information about some terrific policy opportunities. But again, there are probably from my record so far, at least 20 local food policy councils throughout the region, and probably more, because they do seem to keep popping up all over the place. And as I said before, the names sometimes don't necessarily tell you exactly whether or not they're a food policy council. But again, I see that those local food policy councils as kind of a laboratory, a place where new ideas can be tested out, incubated, and often sent into higher levels, into the major leagues after they've been in the minors for a while, and plus the local food policy councils often provide the constituents that are the ones who are going to speak up and advocate for more robust local, rather state and regional food policy. Whether you're attending a hearing at your state legislature or you're advocating before your city council, those food policy councils are going to be providing those troops, those soldiers, to really move the work along. And also, I think the other thing that's really important about that local effort and how that local needs to be sort of scaling up to state and federal is that at a local level, you have contacts. You have contacts with different stakeholders, relationships with planners, local planners, and elected officials. And all those people can be brought into the conversation in a way that enables you to test out new and apply new policy options in your own area, but often, again, to bring them to the state level. You know the landscape. You know who the players are. You have partners and access to policymakers already. And I think that you should continue to exploit those connections. But again, you now have this report, which I wish I had, when I was practicing in Connecticut 12 years ago now. But now you have these tremendous policy options, and it will hopefully enable you to become even more innovative and start new ideas. So I think I'm going to bring my remarks to a close here. I think there's an opportunity expressed in this report for lots of great connections. I think we always have this challenge of how do we make these connections from local to state to federal. I would hope that as practitioners at a local level or state level, that you're always looking at what the federal connections are. What is the synergy between federal, state, and local? I know that many, many times, if there wasn't somebody paying attention from a local or state level, that good opportunities would be lost that were available from the federal government. Programs that were not well utilized. As programs and their implementation trickle down from the feds to the state level, things often get lost, and the state maybe doesn't take full advantage of all the opportunities offered by federal food and ag programs. So, paying attention and again looking at that synergy between these different levels of government is an important role for all of you to play. And again, the report begins to suggest what those connections might look like. So I'd also would add that I know that in addition to having your partnerships and these connections and your knowledge of the landscape, you also are in the position to do assessments, food assessments, and to provide you with more information about the needs of your own community and your own state. And when you look at a report like this and you say, well, Vermont is doing this, and we have this problem in Massachusetts that we know about and we can document, and we see that maybe this solution that Vermont offers could be applicable to what we're doing in Massachusetts. Again, you have a toolbox with lots of good solutions. I think I'm going to bring it to a close there. I certainly would love the opportunity to meet with food policy councils, food coalitions, and other food system networks face-to-face. July 28th or 29th would be fantastic because I will be in the region. And perhaps I might suggest that if people are interested in those and that those dates might work, that you send either me or Kathy Roof an email. I'll also say that I am here to help, and please contact me via email. I think the area where I can provide you with the most assistance is as a practitioner, how would I apply some of these policies to my own situation, and how would I utilize the partners and the organizations and the councils and so forth that I might be working with in order to make the best use of these policy, this list of policies that are embodied in the report. So I'll leave it there, and again, thank you for the opportunity to speak, and hopefully the opportunity to work with you face-to-face.
Thanks, Mark. So we have a few minutes left, and this is going to be our second opportunity for questions and answers. We do have a few more questions that have been entered already. If you have a question, please take the opportunity to type it in on the screen, and that'll get sent over to us. The first question is, what role is there for our EPA regional office? And I assume that refers to some of the policy objectives described in the report, and I'll take a crack at answering that. There's one specific area where I'd like to mention that there's an opportunity with EPA, and this really sort of speaks to the fact that EPA has the opportunity in many cases to weigh in on the regulatory activities of other federal agencies. They also have the opportunity to support or show a lack of support for federal policy outside of the regulatory realm legislation. There's a specific opportunity right now, which is as the Food Safety Modernization Act regulations are being developed by FDA, they are subject to an environmental law called the National Environmental Policy Act, which includes a provision for other agencies to weigh in. And in fact, 2 of the rules that have been released by the FDA, draft rules, the Produce Safety Rule and the Preventive Controls Rule, FDA has agreed to engage in an environmental review process under NEPA for the Produce Safety Rule. They're not doing that for the Preventive Controls Rule. This is an area where EPA Region 1 could really be taking an increased role by stepping up to say these draft rules that you've produced are going to have an incredible environmental impact in the Northeast region. There are concerns that these rules would hinder the use of conservation practices on farms, that they would put small and medium-sized farms out of business, which would have a negative environmental impact. And on CLF's website, you can read more about what some of the environmental impacts of those rules are thought to be. And so that's an example of where EPA could be stepping up and saying, you know, we think you need to be taking a closer look at the environmental impacts of these rules, which impacts the agricultural community. That's one example, but that's the type of role that EPA could be playing on a more regular basis. And certainly you could reach out to EPA to encourage them to do that. The next question has to do with New York State, and it says, I understand that this report is focused mostly towards New England, but the New York State water and food sheds impact New England eaters, and New York City as a food marketplace is important to New England farmers. So is there a reason why New York food policy is not specifically included in this report? Chris or Kathy, would either of you want to take a crack at answering that?
Sure, I can. This is Chris. I think that the short answer is that at least 2 of the organizations are New England focused. I mean, obviously American Farmland Trust is national, but the New England office did that. We are New England Conservation Law Foundation, New England. NESAWG is a broader range. And we had to draw a line somewhere, and it was already a challenge with this report to really look comprehensively at 6 states, and adding in New York would have been a lot more to do. So I think that we all understand the importance of New York to in terms of economic opportunities for New England farmers, and that food systems are overlapping, and there is a lot of impact around New York. And there are, I think, some things that we would like to, and probably will when we go deep in a couple of these webinars, to focus on. For instance, the recently passed New York State food metrics bill, I think, is a very good example of a state that has taken action to be able to try and track what its institutions are procuring. So there's an example of a New York policy that might be one that states in New England would want to look at. So we meant no evil towards New York. We appreciate New York greatly, but we just had to draw a line somewhere.
Thanks. And our next question has to do with the type of local assistance that Mark and others associated with our project might be able to provide. The question is, on the local level, I'd be interested in receiving assistance to develop county-specific economic data that supports an improved food system. For example, to raise awareness of this agenda in my community, I need solid economic data because that's the community's primary lens used to filter priorities. Is this the type of support that Mark and others in your group could provide? Mark or Kathy?
I certainly could have a conversation on that topic. The further we go into the technical areas in how to access that data, how to use that data, the further we'll get from my expertise. But I think I can I could guide you and have and start to look at what exactly what you need, how you intend to use it, and do you have sort of the capacity organizationally and otherwise to utilize that kind of data. So I could start the conversation, but we might have to look at other resources as well.
Great. Well, with that, we're now at 1:15, and I want to thank everyone for attending and participating in this discussion. You will be sent a follow-up email that will provide a link to a web page where you'll have access to the webinar recording and other follow-up materials, so keep an eye out for that. Please also keep an eye out for information on our future webinars, which will be happening later this summer, and be in touch with us if we can provide training and technical assistance or help facilitate policy discussions or present at your group meetings as Kathy and Mark described. Thank you so much for your participation, and have a good afternoon, everyone.